بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على خاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
أما بعد، فقد قال العزيز في كتابه: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، لقد كان لكم في رسول الله أسوة حسنة لمن كان يرجو الله واليوم الآخر وذكر الله كثيرا. صدق الله العلي العظيم. عطروا أفواهكم وزينوا مجالسكم بذكر محمد وآل محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
In order to appreciate the magnitude of the political and social reforms that occurred under the leadership of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it's important for us to first speak briefly about the political and the social conditions that existed in Arabia before the advent of Islam. You find, brothers and sisters, that if I were to describe the pre-Islamic era in one word, that word would be anarchy. Historians are baffled when they study the age of ignorance, Zamanul Jahiliyyah, because they find a society that lived in such a way that they had virtually no political organization. They lived in such a way that they lived generation after generation and century after century with absolutely no government. You find that because there was no government, consequently there were no laws in Arabia before Islam. The only law that existed was lawlessness. And you find that hatred and vendetta consumed Arabs for generations. Since there were no police, there were no courts or judges, you find that the only protection an individual could find was the protection given to him by his tribe. And therefore it was the responsibility of tribes to provide protection to their members, even if they were to commit crimes. And therefore you find that asabiyya was widespread in Arabia. Tribalism often took precedence over ethics and morality. Since Arabia had no government and there were no laws and there was no police, you find, and there was no legal system, you find that for many centuries the Arabs were locked into ceaseless warfare. Warfare was so common that in Arabia it was considered a sport. It was a pastime. Nowadays, the pastime and the sport of our youth are, basketball, football, soccer. In Arabia before Islam, the sport for the youth was to engage in warfare. So this was the political condition of Arabia before the advent of Islam. And you find that when you examine the social conditions of Arabia, they were just as abhorrent. Arabia was a male-dominated society. A society that gave absolutely no rights to females. It gave no rights to non-Arabs. It was a society that used to buy and sell their women as commodities. The Arabs believe that a woman brought shame to a tribe. And the Holy Quran depicts this and tells us about how the Arabs would react when they received the news of the birth of a daughter. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Holy Quran says, وَإِذَا بُشِّرَ أَحَدُهُمْ بِالْأُنْثَى ظَلَّ وَجْهُهُ مُسْوَدًّا وَهُوَ كَظِيمٌ. When they used to receive news that they have been given a daughter, the Quran says their faces become blackened with anger. Because they know that if they don't have a son, their legacy will not continue. Their name is not carried on by their daughters, but rather it is carried on by their sons. Because their daughters don't inherit. Their daughters are valueless in the eyes of society. And therefore they used to bury their female infants alive. They wouldn't kill them and bury them. They would put them 6 feet under while they were alive. And therefore you find that drunkenness was also a common vice among the Arabs. And along with their drinking problems, they were also gamblers. They were compulsive drinkers and gamblers. And the majority of the Arabs were illiterate and highly uneducated. And therefore you find that many of them were idol worshippers. The vast majority of them, yes, there were Christians and some Jews and some who held on to the tradition of Ibrahim, but the vast majority of them were idol worshippers. They were idol worshippers. And they converted the Kaaba, which was the symbol of Tawheed, for thousands of years. They turned it from a symbol of Tawheed to a storage facility for 360 idols. Each tribe had an idol that they would worship. In fact, in some cases, each family had an idol that they used to bow before and prostrate before. In this society, in this environment, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi was born. Sallu ala Muhammad wa alihi.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
In such a society, the Prophet was born. Many youth nowadays, they complain about how difficult it is to be religious, how difficult it is to adhere to the teachings of Islam because of the polluted environment. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi is the best example of someone who stood strong in the face of peer pressure. He would seek refuge in a nearby cave that overlooked the valley of Mecca. He would meditate, he would worship, he would withdraw himself from that polluted environment. Many people have the false impression that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi sat idle, not doing anything until the age of 40. When in fact, one of the greatest achievements of the Prophet was something that he did when he was in his 20s. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi was part of an organization called Hilf al-Fudul, the League of Justice. He joined this organization when he was in his early 20s. This organization was formed because there was a man in Mecca from the tribe of Bani Zubayd. He sold some merchandise to Al-As bin Wa'il, a man who has a laundry list of crimes against Islam and against the Holy Prophet, a man who even his progeny were enemies of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. This man, he received the goods, but he refused to give payment to this man. When he refused to give payment, this poor trader went to the other famous and well-known traders in Mecca, complaining to them, seeking their help, but they refused to help him. So he goes to Jabal Abu Qubays in Mecca, and he stands on top of the mountain, and he says, "O people, help this man who has been oppressed in the city of Mecca." And therefore, after this organization was formed, and Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi joined them, and they made a vow that they will stand by the oppressed and the weak and seek justice and fight oppression. And many years after, even after the Prophet began his mission, he would often tell his companions how honored he was to be a part of that organization and fight for justice. Now, you find, brothers and sisters, that when Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi began his mission, when he officially began his mission at the age of 40, he was very vocal against the atrocities that he witnessed, against the corruption. He spoke out against the burial of female infants. He spoke out against the racism that existed in the hearts of the Arabs. He preached equality, he preached monotheism. He was very vocal, and this agitated the aristocrats of Quraysh. So they approach his uncle Abu Talib. They tell him, "Oh Abu Talib, your nephew is agitating us. He's causing us a lot of trouble. Our children are joining him. He's creating conflict in our homes. So speak to him. We're willing to offer him anything. If he desires women, we will marry him to the most beautiful of women. If he desires wealth, we will give him wealth. If he desires power, we'll make him the king of Arabia." What does he want? Talk to your nephew. Abu Talib, he goes to his beloved nephew and he says to him that the chiefs of Quraysh are bothered by your mission. And they are offering you women, wealth, and power for you just to stop this movement. What do you say? Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, he says, والله يا عم لو وضعوا الشمس في يميني والقمر في شمالي على أن أترك أمر هذا الدين ما فعلت حتى يظهر الله دينه أو أموت دونه. If they were to place, I swear my uncle, if they were to place the sun in my right hand and the moon in my left, so that I abandon this mission, I will not until Allah makes this religion prevail or I die on this path. Now this is a lesson for us, brothers and sisters. Here in the West, we're a minority. We live in an atmosphere that is charged with hatred. A very Islamophobic environment. Rasulullah lived in a very similar environment. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi there at that moment teaches us that just because you face adversity, just because you are in an anti-Islamic environment, it doesn't mean that you should compromise. It doesn't mean that you should conform. You can coexist, but the important thing is that you preserve your identity and you continue spreading the message at all costs. And you find that when persecution intensified, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, he assembled a group and he sent them to Abyssinia, headed by Ja'far, the son of Abu Talib. And when he told them that I am sending you to a Christian king, some of the naive companions, they say, Ya Rasulullah, we're Muslims. You're sending us to a Christian king? What are we going to do under the rulership of a Christian king? Rasulullah tells them, Inna fil habasha malikan la yuzlamu indahu ahad. In Abyssinia, there is a king who does not oppress anyone. This is also a lesson for us. That we have to, if we want to spread Islam, if we want to spread Islam throughout the world, we have to form alliances with Ahlul Kitab, with those from Ahlul Kitab who stand up for justice and equality. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what does He say in the Holy Quran? He addresses the Prophet. He says, قُلْ يَا أَهْلَ الْكِتَابِ تَعَالَوْا إِلَىٰ كَلِمَةٍ سَوَاءٍ بَيْنَنَا وَبَيْنَكُمْ أَلَّا نَعْبُدَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ وَلَا نُشْرِكَ بِهِ شَيْئًا. O people of the book. And the Quran uses the most respectful title when we address the Jews and the Christians. We call them people of the book because we recognize them as recipients of divine revelation. And therefore, we say to them, and the Prophet says to them, come to a common word between us and you, that we don't worship anyone other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore you find when the Meccans and when the Quraysh realized that the Prophet was not going to stop spreading his mission, when they saw the determination and the fortitude of the Prophet and the Muslims, they decided to boycott the Prophet. They decided to boycott the Muslims socially and economically. And therefore the Muslims, they sought refuge in the Shi'b of Abu Talib, the mountain hideout of Abu Talib. For 3 years, none of the Meccans engaged in any economic transactions with them. They would not supply them with food. None of the Meccans were allowed to marry or enter into any contracts with the Muslims. And for 3 years, Rasulullah faced the most severe hardships. During that time period, he loses his beloved wife, Lady Khadija. He loses his uncle Abu Talib, and he names that year Amul Huzn. And we have a narration from Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi. La basallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Rasulullah himself, he says, لَقَدْ أَتَتْ عَلَيَّ 30 مِنْ يَوْمٍ وَلَيْلَةٍ وَمَالِي وَلِبِلَالٍ طَعَامٌ نَأْكُلُهُ ذُو كَبِدٍ إِلَّا شَيْءٌ يُوَارِيهِ إِبْطُ بِلَالٍ. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, he says, we went 30 days without any food. 30 days without food. He says, all we used to eat was whatever Bilal would gather from the leaves and the plants in the nearby area. For 30 days, Rasulullah suffered. And this is true leadership. True leadership is not to guide from a throne, not to lead from a throne, not to lead from behind. Rasulullah was among the people. He was tasting the hardship. And this is exactly what Rasulullah instilled in his greatest student, Ali ibn Abi Talib. Ali ibn
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
And this is the exact thing Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam used to say. He used to lead from the bottom. He used to live among the people. He used to taste their hardships. Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, he says, أَأَقْنَعُ مِن نَفْسِي بِأَنْ يُقَالَ هَذَا أَمِيرَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ وَلَا أُشَارِكُهُمْ فِي مَكَارِهِ الدَّارِ. The Imam says, am I satisfied that people call me the commander of the faithful while I do not share in their hardships? This is leadership. To live among the people, to face the same hardships that they face. And after spending 13 years in Mecca, there was eventually an assassination plot against the Prophet. And Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, he migrates from Mecca to Medina. And the first thing the Prophet does in Medina is not the building of a mosque. He doesn't organize an army to go fight the Meccans. The first thing that he does is establish brotherhood between the Muslims. The Muhajireen, they have left Mecca and they're arriving in Medina empty-handed. No money, no food, no clothing, nothing. They were empty-handed. And therefore, Rasulullah assigned each Ansari Muslim to take care of a Muhajiri Muslim. The Ansar, they welcomed the Muhajireen with open arms. Some of the Ansaris showed so much sacrifice that if an Ansari Muslim was married to more than one wife, he would divorce his wife and give his wife to his fellow brother. The Muhajireen lived in the homes of the Ansar. They would split their wealth 50-50. This is the spirit of brotherhood Rasulullah instilled in them. These were people that were from a society of warfare, of bloodshed, that used to fight against each other, and now they are splitting their wealth with each other. They're living side by side. This was what the Prophet was able to accomplish. And after Rasulullah assigns each Muslim to take care of a Muslim, there is one man who approaches him. Ali ibn Abi Talib salawatullahi alayhi.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
He comes to the Prophet, his eyes are filled with tears. He says, Ya Rasulullah, أخيت بين أصحابك ولم تؤاخي بيني وبين أحد. Ya Rasulullah, you assigned each Muslim a brother, but you didn't assign anyone to me. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, he says, Ya Ali, anta akhi fi dunya wal akhirah. Oh Ali, you are my brother in this world and the hereafter. وَالَّذِي بَعَثَنِي بِالْحَقِّ نَبِيًّا مَا أَخَّرْتُكَ إِلَّا لِنَفْسِي. I swear by the one who sent me as a prophet, I reserved you for me. You are my brother. فَأَنْتَ مِنِّي بِمَنْزِلَةِ هَارُونَ مِنْ مُوسَى إِلَّا أَنَّهُ لَا نَبِيَّ بَعْدِي وَأَنْتَ أَخِي وَوَارِثِي. You are to me as Aaron is to Musa, but there is no prophet after me. And you find, brothers and sisters, that Rasulullah fought 83 battles. And in the first battle of Islam, he taught Muslims and he taught even the non-Muslims the rules of combat. He taught them humanity even in the battlefield. After the battle of Badr, there were 50 prisoners who were brought to the Prophet. You have to understand that before Islam, if there were any prisoners, they would be finished. Their heads would be chopped off, they would be robbed, their women would be raped. There were no rules of combat. So 50 prisoners are brought to the Prophet. And they ask the Prophet, Ya Rasulullah, what should we do with these prisoners? Abu Bakr suggests we should ransom them. We can get money off of them. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi says, no, we will not kill them, nor will we ransom them. He tells them, first remove the ropes that you have tied around them. You are treating them like animals. Yes, they fought against us, but they're still human beings. Remove the ropes from their necks and their wrists because the rope is cutting into their skin. Treat them humanely. Give them the food that you eat. Allow them to drink what you drink. Let them stay in your homes. And if they are able, if one of them is able to teach 10 Muslims to read and write, then free him. What a terrorist, huh? What a terrorist. This is what Muslims need to know. When they are challenged by non-Muslims and when people say Rasulullah was a warmonger, He was a bloodthirsty ruler. These are the things that you present to them. These are the things that you have to use to educate others. You find, brothers and sisters, that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the battle of Khandaq, he also teaches another lesson to political leaders and religious leaders. And that is, you should not always impose your view on others. You have to seek consultation. Allah says in the Holy Quran, وَلَوْ كُنْتَ فَضًّا غَلِيظَ الْقَلْبِ لَانْفَضُّوا مِنْ حَوْلِكَ فَاعْفُ عَنْهُمْ وَاسْتَغْفِرْ لَهُمْ وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ. In the battle of Khandaq, there were 10,000 troops marching towards Medina to destroy the Prophet and to destroy Islam. Rasulullah doesn't have 10,000 with him. So he asks his companions, what do you suggest I do? Rasulullah, of course, he's the best commander. He could have given an order, but he wants to set a precedent for future leaders. That if you want to be an efficient leader, you should seek consultation. You should ask for advice. So Salman al-Farisi suggests to the Prophet, let us build a trench around Medina. Because he was from Persia and they had experience fighting with the Romans. And this is what they used to do when they were faced with a large army. But brothers and sisters, one of the greatest political achievements of the Prophet was not a battle, nor was it an expedition. It was a peace treaty that he performed. In the 6th year after the Hijrah, in the month of Dhul Qa'dah, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi sees a dream that he's going to perform the pilgrimage. So he wakes up the following morning, he assembles his followers, 1,400 of them march towards Mecca. News reaches the Meccans that Rasulullah with his companions, they are entering Mecca. They intercept them. And they stop the Prophet, they prevent him from entering Mecca. The Meccans, the Quraysh, they send an expert negotiator by the name of Suhail. And he begins negotiating with the Prophet, and they come to certain terms, and this was known as the Treaty of Hudaybiyyah. They come to an agreement, and the agreement was that the Muslims would return to Medina and not perform the Umrah that year. Some of the Muslims were angry. In fact, one prominent companion even questioned the prophethood of the Prophet on that day. He asked him, are you really a prophet of Allah? You told us we're going to perform the pilgrimage. Rasulullah says, yes, but I didn't say when we will perform it. But he questioned. He continued to question just as he continued to question for the remainder of his life. Number 2, they agreed that there will be 10 years of peace between them. 10 years of peace. And this was a very strategic move by the Prophet. As a leader, you have to be visionary. You have to plan not only for next year or the year after. As Muslims, we should come together and plan for what will happen 10 years from now, 20 years from now, a century from now. 10 years of peace. Rasulullah needs this time to spread the message of Islam. Number 3, and look at the genius of the Prophet. He says, if anyone in Mecca accepts Islam and seeks refuge in Medina, we extradite him back to Mecca. If anyone in Mecca accepts Islam and comes to Medina to seek refuge, we will send him back to Mecca. And if there is any Muslim in Medina who goes towards Mecca, you do not have to send him back. You keep him in Mecca. Why? Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, he wants a Muslim presence in a city that is dominated by idol worshippers. Why? So they learn the akhlaq Rasulullah taught. This is how you spread Islam. You spread Islam by your mannerism, by your conduct. He wanted the Muslims to show the Meccans what Islam was about through their actions. And finally, they agreed to allow people to enter into treaties or contracts with the Quraysh and with the Muslims. And the Muslims would perform the Umrah the next year. Rasulullah calls upon Ali ibn Abi Talib. He says, write down the treaty. Let's begin writing. Rasulullah says, oh Ali, write Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Suhail says, stop. Don't write Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. If we believed Allah was ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, we would not fight you. We don't accept this. He erases it. Oh Ali, write Muhammad Rasulullah. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. Oh Ali, write Muhammad, the messenger of Allah. Suhail says, if we believe that you were the messenger of Allah, again we wouldn't fight you. Rasulullah tells Ali, oh Ali, erase Rasulullah. Ali ibn Abi Talib says, I can't, Ya Rasulullah. How can I erase something that is imprinted on my heart? Rasulullah says, erase it, O Ali, because there will come a day when your right is also usurped from you. And this is indeed what happened. After this treaty was signed, Allah reveals the following verse. Inna fatahna laka fathan mubina. We have given you the victory. We have given you the victory. And in the 8th year after the Hijrah, Rasulullah conquers Mecca with 10,000 soldiers. In the past, when people used to conquer lands, they would destroy the city. They would rape women. They would kill men. Look at how Rasulullah conquers Mecca. He is on a camel and behind him are 10,000 soldiers. He has his head bowed out of humility before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says, all of you are safe. Whoever enters the house of Abu Sufyan is safe. He tells his companions, do not harm anyone. Do not even destroy any trees or any vegetation. He calls upon Bilal. And he tells Bilal, Bilal, go call the adhan. Go make the call for prayer. And there's a reason why. It wasn't an accident that Rasulullah appointed Bilal as the mu'adhin. Bilal was an African. Africans were slaves. They were second-class citizens. Rasulullah was trying to teach us that it is not the color of your skin that gives you precedence. It is the purity of your heart. When Bilal used to recite the adhan, he wasn't able to pronounce the letter sheen. He used to say, Ashadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashadu an la ilaha illallah. Some of the companions of the Prophet would mock Bilal. They would tell the Prophet, Ya Rasulullah, we are Arabs. Our tongues are pure. Let us recite the adhan. Why do you have Bilal reciting the call for prayer? Rasulullah says to them, the scene of Bilal is a sheen in the eyes of Allah. This was how the Prophet led. Through example, not only through words. And therefore the adhan is called, the people gather. These are the same people that drove the Prophet out of Mecca, that killed his uncle Hamza, that were the result of the death of Khadija and Abu Talib, and the cause of the death of many of his companions. They all gather. And Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, he says to them, Ya ma'shara Quraysh, O Quraysh, ma tarawna anni fa'ilun bikum. What should I do with you? You fought against me, you persecuted me. How should I deal with you? They say to him, Akhun kareem wa ibnu akhin kareem. You are a generous man, the son of a generous man. Rasulullah says to them, I say to you today the same thing that Yusuf said to his brothers when they wronged him. اذهبوا فأنتم الطلقاء. Go, you are free. And we conclude with this, brothers and sisters, when Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi was at the climax of his power, when he was at the height of his power, he was visited by one of his companions. He enters into the house of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi and he begins to cry. He sees how the Prophet was living and he begins to cry. Rasulullah says, وَمَا يُبْكِيك? Why do you cry? He says to the Prophet that, Ya Nabi Allah, وَمَا لِي لَا أَبْكِي? How can I not cry? وَهَذَا الْحَصِيرُ قَدْ أَثَّرَ فِي جَنْبِكَ. How can I not cry when I see the mark of the straw mat imprinted on your body? Rasulullah used to sleep on the ground, on a straw mat. وَهَذَا الْحَصِيرُ قَدْ أَثَّرَ فِي جَنْبِكَ وَهَذِهِ خِزَانَتُكَ لَا أَرَى فِيهَا إِلَّا مَا أَرَى. I see nothing in your house. There's no food. You are the Prophet of Allah. You are our ruler, our master. And this is how you live. وَذَاكَ كِسْرَى وَقَيْصَرْ فِي الثِّمَارِ وَالْأَنْهَارِ. There's Caesar, the ruler of Persia. They live in luxury. وَأَنْتَ نَبِيُّ اللَّهِ وَصَفْوَتُهُ وَهَذِهِ خِزَانَتُكَ. And you are the Prophet of Allah. You are the chosen one. And this is how you live. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi, he smiles and he tells him, أَمَا تَرْضَى أَن تَكُولَ لَنَا الْآخِرَةَ وَلَهُمُ الدُّنْيَا. Are you not satisfied that Allah has given us akhirah and He has given them the dunya? What's the value of this world? Rasulullah says, he says, إِن كَانَتِ الدُّنْيَا تَعْدِلُ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ جَنَاحَ بَعُوضَةٍ مَا سَقَى الْكَافِرُ وَالْفَاجِرُ مِنْهَا شَرْبَةً مِّن مَّاءٍ. If this world was worth, if the value of this world was equivalent to the wing of a fly, Allah would have not allowed a single disbeliever to sip water from it. has no value. And this is what we learn from the Prophet, brothers and sisters. In his last days, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi, the last days of his life, he goes to the masjid, he is helped by his companions, and he sits on the last step of the minbar. And he looks at the Muslims and he says, is there anyone among you, I am in my last days, is there anyone among you who has a right against me? Have I oppressed any of you? Have I wronged any of you? If I have, come forward. One man stands up by the name of Sawada. Sawada stands up. He says, Ya Rasulullah, I want to seek revenge against you for what you did to me. Rasulullah says, what have I done? He says, on our way back from Ta'if, you were on your donkey and you accidentally whipped me. You were trying to direct the donkey to walk in a certain direction and your stick or your whip struck me. And now I want to strike you in the same way that I was struck. All the Muslims are in shock. What does the Prophet say? He says, Bilal, oh Bilal, go to the house of Fatima and give me the whip that was in my hand on that day. Bilal goes and he brings the whip and he puts it in the hand of Rasulullah. Sawada is standing before the Prophet. The Muslims are in shock. He gives the whip to Sawada. Sawada holds the whip. Rasulullah says, Ya Sawada, ata'fu am taqtas? Do you pardon me or do you want to seek retribution against me? Sawada says, Ya Rasulullah, on the day that I was struck by this whip, I didn't have a shirt. So lift your shirt so the whip can strike your flesh just as it struck my flesh on that day. Rasulullah lifts his shirt and he exposes his chest. Rasulullah says, Sawada, go ahead. Sawada drops the whip and he kisses the chest of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi. And he says, Oh Allah, I ask you not to punish and take me to the fire of hell because these lips have kissed the holy body of Rasulullah. Of course I forgive you and I pardon you, Ya Rasulullah. What does the Prophet say? Rasulullah raises his hands and he says, Oh Allah, Allahumma afu an Sawada kama afa an nabiyyika Muhammad. Oh Sawada, oh Allah, forgive and pardon Sawada just as he pardoned your Prophet. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless us and to guide us and to illuminate our hearts with the teachings of Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to honor us with the ziyarah of Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad in this life. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us and to crown us with the shafa'ah, the intercession of Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad on the day of judgment. يَوْمَ لَا يَنْفَعُ مَالٌ وَلَا بَنُونَ إلا من أتى الله بقلب سليم وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على محمد وآله الطاهرين.